Sometimes the people God chooses aren't the ones we expect, not the tallest, not the strongest, not the loudest in the room. Sometimes God chooses someone who's out in a field, all alone, playing music to sheep, talking to the sky, writing poems that no one hears. That's where we find David. He wasn't a warrior or a king. He was a shepherd boy, the youngest of 8 brothers, forgotten by his own family. But God didn't forget him. While everyone else was looking at height, strength, and appearance, God was looking at something deeper: David's heart. You may know David as the boy who killed a giant, or the man who became king, or maybe the one who made a terrible mistake and begged for forgiveness. But David's story is so much more than that. It's the story of a boy who believed when no one else did, of a young man who sang to calm a troubled king, of a soldier who chose mercy instead of revenge, of a king who danced before God with all his heart. And yes, it's also the story of a man who failed, who sinned, who broke God's heart, and then came crawling back, not with excuses, but with tears. God didn't love David because he was perfect. He loved David because David never stopped coming back to him, even when he messed up, even when it hurt. That's why the Bible calls David a man after God's own heart. Not because he got it all right, but because when he got it wrong, he ran back to God with everything he had. And maybe that's why David's story still speaks to us today. Because deep down, we all want to know, can God still love someone like me? David's life says, yes, always.
Before David was ever a king, he was just a boy, watching sheep. He lived in a small town called Bethlehem. His father's name was Jesse, and Jesse had 8 sons. David was the youngest. While his older brothers trained to be soldiers and worked in the house, David was sent to the fields. His job was to watch over sheep day after day, all alone. But David didn't waste his time. He talked to God. He played his harp. He wrote songs under the stars. And in that quiet place, David's heart grew close to God. One day, something unexpected happened. The prophet Samuel came to visit Jesse's house. God had told Samuel to go and anoint a new king, someone who would one day lead Israel. But God didn't say which son it would be. So Jesse called in his oldest son, Eliab, tall, strong, confident. Samuel looked at him and thought, this must be the one. But God whispered, do not look at his appearance or height. I have rejected him. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. One by one, Jesse's sons stood before Samuel, 7 sons, 7 no's. Then Samuel asked, are these all your sons? Jesse paused, maybe a little embarrassed. Well, there's still the youngest, but he's out in the field watching the sheep. Samuel said, send for him. We won't sit down until he comes. So they called for David. He came in, young, dusty, with the smell of sheep on his clothes. He didn't look like a king. But God saw something deeper. And God said to Samuel, this is the one. Anoint him. So right there in front of his family, David was chosen. Samuel poured oil on his head, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. He wasn't a king yet. He would go back to the fields. But something had changed. God had chosen him. And when God chooses you, he never forgets.
Sometime after David was anointed, a great war began. The Israelites were facing a powerful enemy, the Philistines. And the Philistines had a secret weapon, a giant named Goliath. He was over 9 feet tall, covered in armor from head to toe. He carried a massive spear, and his voice boomed across the valley. Every day, Goliath would come out and mock God's people. He shouted, send someone to fight me. If he wins, we'll be your servants. But if I win, you'll be ours. And every day, no one moved, not even King Saul. Everyone was too scared. For 40 days, Goliath came out and challenged them.
And then David showed up. He wasn't there to fight. He had come to bring food to his brothers. But when David heard Goliath mocking God and saw no one stepping forward, he couldn't believe it. He said, "Who is this man that defies the armies of the living God?" People laughed. "You're just a boy," they said. But David remembered the times God helped him fight off lions and bears to protect his sheep. He knew one thing: God was stronger than Goliath. So David went to King Saul and said, "Let me fight him." Saul tried to give him armor, but it was too big. So David took it off. Instead, he walked into the valley with a sling and 5 smooth stones. As Goliath laughed and shouted insults, David stood firm, and he said, "You come to me with sword and spear, but I come to you in the name of the Lord Almighty. Today, the Lord will deliver you into my hands." Then David ran forward, loaded a stone in his sling, and let it fly. The stone hit Goliath right in the forehead, and the giant fell. Just like that. No sword, no armor, just faith. David ran up, took Goliath's sword, and finished the battle. The enemy ran. Israel shouted. And a shepherd boy became a hero. Not because he was strong, but because he believed that God was stronger. After David defeated Goliath, everything changed. People started talking about him everywhere. The young shepherd boy had become a national hero. Songs were written about him. Crowds cheered for him. They sang, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." At first, King Saul was grateful. He made David a commander in his army. He invited him into the palace. He even gave him his daughter Michal to marry. But something started to grow in Saul's heart: jealousy. Each time David won a battle, the people loved him more, and Saul felt smaller. He started to watch David closely, not with love, but with fear. David, meanwhile, was humble. He didn't ask for power or fame. He served Saul faithfully and even became close friends with Saul's son, Jonathan. David also had a special gift. He could play the harp. When Saul felt anxious or troubled, David would play music. The sounds would calm Saul's heart, but the peace didn't last. One day, while David was playing, Saul suddenly picked up a spear and threw it at him, not once, but twice. David dodged it both times, and from that moment on, he knew Saul wanted him dead. Still, David didn't fight back. He didn't try to take Saul's throne. He ran. He hid. He lived in caves and forests. But even in hiding, David trusted God. He wrote songs during that time, psalms of fear and faith. He cried out to God, not with anger, but with honesty. Even while hunted and hated, David refused to stop believing. Because David didn't want the crown without God. He only wanted it with him. And sometimes faith means waiting, even when you're ready, even when you're right. David waited, because he knew that when God wants to lift someone up, He'll do it at the right time. David had every reason to hate Saul. He had been faithful. He had served. He had done nothing wrong. But Saul still hunted him like a criminal. David had to live like a fugitive, hiding in caves, moving from place to place, always watching his back. But David never stopped trusting God. And one day, something unexpected happened. David and his men were hiding deep in a cave. They were quiet, staying low in the shadows. Then they heard footsteps. It was King Saul. He had come into the cave, not to search for David, but to rest. He didn't know David was already inside. David's men whispered, "This is your chance. God has delivered him into your hands. End this." David crept forward, slowly, silently. In his hand was a blade. He got close enough to take Saul's life, but instead, he gently cut off a piece of Saul's robe, and then he stepped back. Even that small act made David's heart feel heavy. When Saul left the cave, David followed after him and called out, "My lord, the king." Saul turned around, and there stood David, holding the piece of cloth. David said, "I could have killed you, but I didn't."
"I will not lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. See this cloth? I am not your enemy." Saul was stunned. He began to cry. He said, "You are more righteous than I. May the Lord reward you. I know you will surely be king one day." Even Saul, for a moment, saw David's heart. David had power in his hands that day, but instead of using it to harm, he chose mercy, because David understood something deep and true. Revenge might feel good for a moment, but honor lasts forever. In the darkness of that cave, David passed the test. He proved he wasn't just strong with a sling. He was strong with his spirit.
The day finally came, after years of waiting, after running from Saul.
After hiding in caves, crying out to God, and refusing to fight back, David's time had come.
Saul had died in battle, and the people needed a new king. At first, only the tribe of Judah made David their king. But after more time passed, the other tribes joined them, and all of Israel united under one man, David. He was no longer the forgotten shepherd, he was the king of a nation. But David didn't rule like most kings. He didn't build walls between himself and the people. He didn't become proud or greedy. He stayed humble. He stayed close to God. One of David's first acts as king was to bring the Ark of the Covenant to the city of Jerusalem. The Ark was sacred. It represented God's presence. When it finally arrived, David didn't stand still in royal robes. He danced. He danced in the streets with joy, wearing a simple linen garment. He wasn't thinking about what people thought. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was worshipping with all his heart. Some laughed. Some whispered, "That's not how a king should act." But David didn't care. He said, "I will become even more undignified than this, if it means honoring the Lord." That's who David was. Yes, he was a warrior. Yes, he was a king. But most of all, he was a worshipper. He wrote songs. He played music. He prayed on mountaintops and in his bedroom. David led armies, but he followed God. He didn't just sit on a throne. He knelt before the true king. And under David's rule, Israel grew stronger. Jerusalem became a holy city. The people had peace, but even in his greatest moments, David never forgot where he came from. A field, a sling, and a God who saw his heart. Even the greatest people in the Bible made mistakes, and David made a very big one. One year, while his army was off fighting a war, David stayed home. He wasn't where he was supposed to be. One evening he walked on the rooftop of his palace and looked out. There in the distance, he saw a woman bathing. Her name was Bathsheba. She was beautiful and married. Her husband Uriah was one of David's loyal soldiers, fighting in the very war David had avoided. But David didn't stop looking. He sent someone to bring her to him. He took her for himself, even though she was not his to take. Soon after, Bathsheba sent a message. She was pregnant. David began to panic. He tried to cover it up by bringing Uriah home from battle, hoping he would go to his wife and think the baby was his. But Uriah was too loyal. He refused to enjoy comfort while his fellow soldiers were still fighting. So David made a terrible decision. He sent a secret order to the army: put Uriah on the front lines and then pull back. Let him be exposed. Let him die. And Uriah did. Afterward, David took Bathsheba as his wife, hoping no one would know the truth. But God saw everything. God sent the prophet Nathan to speak to David. Nathan told him a story about a rich man who stole a poor man's only lamb. David became angry and said, "That man deserves to die." Then Nathan looked at David and said, "You are that man." In that moment, David's heart broke. He didn't make excuses. He didn't blame others. He simply said, "I have sinned against the Lord." David prayed. He cried. He wrote Psalm 51 saying, "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me." God forgave David, but the pain of his choice remained. The child died. His family struggled. His heart never forgot. Even a man after God's own heart can fall. But David's story reminds us, God's mercy is greater than our mistakes.
David didn't just fight giants or rule a kingdom. He also wrote songs, some of the most beautiful and honest words in the entire Bible. We call them Psalms. They weren't fancy poems written in a castle. Many of them came from caves, from tears, from dark valleys. Some were written while hiding, some after battles, some after big mistakes. But no matter where he was or what he had done, David always turned to God. His psalms weren't just music, they were prayers. In joy, he sang, "The heavens declare the glory of God. I will praise you, Lord, with all my heart." In fear, he cried, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." In guilt, he confessed, "Create in me a clean heart, O God. Do not take your spirit from me." In trust, he wrote, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." David's words weren't perfect, they were real. He didn't hide his feelings. He didn't pretend to be strong all the time. He just poured out his heart, again and again. That's what made David different. He didn't just love God on the good days. He brought God his anger, his fear, his failure, and his hope. And God listened. David taught us that worship isn't just singing when you're happy. It's being close to God in every moment, even when you don't have the right words. That's why people still read David's Psalms today. They help us pray when we don't know how. They remind us we're not alone. They show us that God wants our whole heart, not just the clean parts. David was a king, a warrior, a shepherd. But in his songs, he was just a child talking to his father. And sometimes that's the most powerful thing we can be. David grew old. The strong young shepherd who once fought lions and giants now walked slowly, his body tired, but his heart still full of worship. He had lived a life of great victory and deep failure. He had sung songs, won wars, and buried loved ones. He had danced before God and wept before him too. Now it was time to say goodbye. Before he died, David called for his son Solomon and gave him the crown. But he didn't just pass on power. He passed on faith. He told Solomon, "Be strong. Obey the Lord. Walk in his ways. Trust him, and he will bless you." Then David rested and was buried in the city he had helped build. But the story of David didn't end there. Long before he died, God had made him a promise. One day, a king will come from your family line, and his kingdom will never end. That promise wasn't just about Solomon. It was about Jesus. Hundreds of years later, in the very town where David once watched sheep, Bethlehem, a baby was born. Not in a palace, but in a stable. Not with a crown, but wrapped in cloth. His name was Jesus, and people called him the Son of David. Jesus would grow up to be the true king. A king not just over Israel, but over the whole world. A king who would heal, forgive, and save. A king whose heart was perfectly in tune with the Father's. David's life pointed toward that king. And that's part of his legacy. Not just what he did, but who came after him. David reminds us that God doesn't use perfect people. He uses open hearts, humble hearts, repentant hearts. That's why David was called a man after God's own heart. And even now, his songs are still sung. His story is still told. And his legacy lives on in the King who reigns forever.